Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives. David Gouthro with another episode of Discover Fresh Perspectives, and today I have the pleasure of having Susan Luke Evans as my guest. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
So, Susan, we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling and kind of like the what and the why and where and things like that. But let me just back up a little bit. So, I've known you professionally for a number of years, and I'm curious how you came to see storytelling as something that was so important. What was that path or process like?
Well, actually, a client got me into it, and I asked them the same question when they asked me to work with their executive team on storytelling because they had a new CEO
Hmm.
that was from Western Australia, and this client happened to be in the southern part of the U.S.
Hmm.
and they didn't understand each other because in Western Australia, they talk really fast and they use a lot of colloquialisms and those kinds of things that nobody was familiar with.
Hmm.
And in the South, they talk real slow and they listen real slow too. So so it was really hard. And I said, "Well, I can give it a try." I said, "I've never done that before." I said, "Why would you ask me?" Because I was there doing management training. And they said, "Because you tell stories all the time when you
Oh.
teach." And so we just figured that, if it was interesting enough and all our people love to listen to your stories, that if we could get the CEO and his team to use more stories to illustrate the points that they want to make or, what they're trying to get across, then people would be more engaged and they'd listen.
So let me ask you a question about that. So you said that people liked your stories, you used them a lot. So I'm curious, was that something you intentionally decided to design stories in, or is this a natural part of who Susan Luke Evans is, and you use stories to illustrate the points? Like how
Yeah,
much
it's
was
it
internal, how
it's
much
pretty
was
natural. I mean, I did it when I taught school. My mom was a storyteller on the radio years before I was born. My dad was a minister, and he used stories, of course, in his sermons.
hmm.
So the family legend is that I came out saying "Once upon a time," which is not exactly true, but I had pretty good role models growing up,
Mhm.
very different styles. But up until my mom passed when she was 101, she was
Wow.
still telling stories at different events at the retirement center where she lived. And, so, it's just something that's always been part of who I am, I guess.
So the case, or the circumstance you talked about was that there's a specific need where telling stories would help each other. But why are stories so powerful?
Well, in my experience, now I'm talking about personal experience stories. I'm not
Mhm.
talking about, adapting a fairy tale to make it work or anything like that. And there are people that do that and they do it very successfully, but that's my thing. Um, so I think because when you share a personal experience, it's usually universal.
Mm.
I began my professional career in Alaska, teaching out in the bush in Native American villages. Fly in September and hope you don't get sick until you fly out in May, that kind of thing, and lived in a log cabin, all that stuff. And and so I've told a lot of stories about the years that I spent there and how it was different and how it was the same and, all those kinds of things. Generally speaking, no one in any audience I've ever told a story to has ever lived in Alaska and taught school out in the bush. But because they'd gone to school, maybe they had taught school someplace else, they had kids that were in school, all of those are universal connections. And so my biggest thing when I'm coaching people to use stories and my pet peeve is everybody, especially in the speaking industry, everybody uses stories in one way or another,
Mhm.
and that's great, but some people don't tell them very well. And so my deal is I want to help you tell your stories well, because if they're not told well, they're not remembered. So personal experiences, connections with other people, slow down. You don't have to tell every single detail. Um, and just kind of let the story unfold. And some folks say, "Well, don't you have a formula?" And "No, I don't." And they said, "Well, I was reading in a book and this guy has 7 steps and blah blah blah." And I said, "If that works for you, hooray." I said, "Here's my formula. A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they don't necessarily have to go in that order."
Oh,
And that's my formula. And I said, "I just can't remember 7 steps, maybe you're smarter than I am, so hooray." But
so
but it connects if you tell it well.
so so it's the Palin connecting to you. How do you use stories when what you're trying to convey is content?
Well,
How do you link them?
I think it helps you when you frame what what your subject is, what your concept is, what's your point that you're trying to get across. So you may have to tell a series of short stories. These don't have to, they shouldn't be forever kind of stories. They should be, this incident, and then relate it to whatever that particular concept or idea is that you're trying to get across. When I first started doing this, the 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 leadership team of that particular client, they were all like engineers and
Mm,
R&D people and very linear and all this kind of stuff. And I started off the session with a story about my child when he was 3 years old. And it was his first echo experience where he yelled across the river and he'd never heard an echo before and all that kind of stuff. It's a cute little story. And they were all just like on the edge of their seat, which was really cute because it was mostly men. I think
mhm,
there were two women in the entire, room. And, and so then we sort of debriefed it a little bit, and I said, "Now, can you tell me why you liked it? Can you tell me what made sense to you?" Because this was my first time to do it too, so I was kind of, "Okay, I hope this works." And then they did that, and if they didn't understand a certain thing, they said so, and so then I tried to explain it a little bit, and then I said, "Okay, now we're gonna go around, and I want each one of you to tell me in no more than 2 sentences, preferably 1 idea or 1 concept that you need to communicate to your team this week."
mhm,
And I said, "I don't even have to understand it,
mhm,
but you do. It's important to you." So they did that. And then I said, "Okay, you have 10 minutes to come up with a story that will help you get that point across." I could have sold tickets, David. They were amazing. And they told stories about their grandparents and about their kids. And I don't think anybody told a story about working. And I had
huh,
told them, I said, it can be a story about anything, but it has to be personal to you and your experience. That was the only qualification. And they were amazing. And then they got so excited. They said, "Oh, you got to teach this to everybody." And and so I said, "Okay." And, and so it just grew from there. And there were some things that happened that people took the initiative after they heard certain things and went out and did them without, asking permission. That was one of the kind of the sub things is the management team said, "If you can get some of our other people to just take the initiative and do some of these little things so that they don't always come to us." And they did, and they came up with
mm.
an internal marketing campaign about a
Oh,
safety issue. I mean, it was really quite interesting the way it evolved, and it gave me a ton of experience in helping people to craft their stories and to tell them, I mean, we debriefed and everything so that there were there were criticisms or suggestions of how they could make it better, but
So you use the term craft the story, and I'm interested, how do you differentiate between, like, what's the difference between a story and someone who just recounts a list of facts in chronological order?
well, the story's interesting if it's told well. Uh, and I think part of the issue with a lot of facts that you're trying
Mhm.
to get across is that either people make the mistake that they need this big long story to try to get them all across in one story, versus a lot of almost anecdotal type stories, just this little event that happened, that can say, so, fact number one, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, and then just do little ones throughout and tie it all together at the end with, so if we do all these things better, how is that going to make our life at work better? Or how is that going to make our office more cheerful? Or how is our clients going to like us better or whatever? And get that feedback from the people that listened to these stories as they were practicing. Um, it works. It to me, it's the easiest way to get a point across or to try to teach somebody a new skill by saying, well, I worked with so and so a couple months ago because they didn't know how to do this either, and this is what happened with them. That's a story. I mean, people,
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be a big long legendary tale, it just has to be something that people are going to listen to. And and just a list of facts, a lot of us, and I'm one of those, I don't like to listen to just, A, B, C, D,
Mhm.
because it makes no sense to me.
So how do so okay, I just a whole pile of questions running through my mind. So one of them is, how do you respond to someone who says, "Well, I'm not a storyteller."
Oh, well, there's usually one or two in every group that say, "Oh, I don't have any stories."
Mhm.
And so I say, "Well, okay, tell me what you've done in the last 24 hours."
Hmm.
And they'll start talking about, oh, they took their kids to their soccer game and then they did this. And I said, so there's nothing in there that you think is kind of an experience that you could make into oh, is that what you mean? And it sometimes just the whole concept of telling a story turns certain people off.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so you sometimes have to dig a little deeper with them and just remind them that, hey, this is not, we're not writing a book. We're not trying to, you know, have a lot of different chapters or anything like that. This is one experience. Maybe this is a 3-minute story. It's not, you're not going to stand up and deliver it for hours.
Right.
And that seems to, you know, get them going. And then when I say, if they're still, well, I don't have any, nothing ever happens to me. Well, just tell me about your last 24 hours. And there's always something. So,
Something they grab onto.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
You'd referenced earlier to a group of engineers
yeah.
that you'd work with, and sometimes, like I find with professionals get together in a room, they gravitate towards the stereotype of that particular profession. When they're out there partying or whatever, they're just, as diverse as any group, but they gravitate around a certain stereotype. And I think sometimes engineers, that's the stereotype of being very serious or
Yes,
things like
yes.
that. So what's some of the rationale you could give to an engineer as to why it would be important to them? What's in it for them to get better at being a storyteller?
Well, in my experience, the biggest benefit for them is that it doesn't take whomever they're trying to convince or train
Mhm.
or communicate facts to, it doesn't take as long for them to understand it because
Okay, saving
because
the
they
time.
they've
Okay.
they've listened
Yeah.
well,
Mhm.
because it's interesting, it's just not the normal kind of conversation. In fact, that same client, later on, it was a year-long contract, and the first part happened relatively close to the beginning. I mean, the first part of the storytelling. And so they kind of tried to incorporate it into their daily operations and remind everybody. And not that every time they opened their mouths, they were going to tell a story, but when
Mhm.
they had something important that they needed to communicate. So anyway, I was there with the CEO, and I went for a week, and so I'd been in his office to plan for the week. And I was filling my briefcase and getting ready to leave, and this his second in command came dashing into the didn't even see me. I was sort of in the back, and he said, "Wait, Peter," he said, we've got to do this." He said, "I'm so glad you sent me to that thing." He said, "We have to tell everybody. This is really great." And he said, "We it's it." He said, "I didn't want to go. You know, I didn't want to go, but it's really important. All these facts that I learned, and so we got to have a meeting, and we got to tell all the leadership team." And he said, but he said, "There's just one problem." He said, "It was really boring." He said, if you hadn't said that you wanted a report, I wouldn't have listened." But he said, "Once I got it all down and I saw how important it was." And so about that time, I kind of was sauntering out the back door of his office, and the guy turned around and he says, "Oh, we can tell a story about it." So it was kind of funny, and they did, and they had a staff meeting, and they came up with ways that they were going to communicate all these boring facts. I have no idea what they were because I wasn't part of that, but they, it was kind of funny to me because they did it in certain areas of the organization better than in others, and then when there was something that was apparently based on his excitement and all of that, very important for all the leadership team to really get a handle on, they they forgot, and they said, "Well, we got to make it interesting, but we don't know how." And then he saw me and he says, "Well, duh," so
I could
it
do
was
this.
kind of
I could
funny.
do this.
So, yeah, I can do that. So it it worked. I think what it does is it helps to elevate the level of communication
Okay.
so that people are listening in a different way because it's interesting. What happened next, or how come that happened?
So I remember when I was on a sabbatical, I used to work for Apple, and I had a 6 week sabbatical that I spent down in the New Mexico area, down around Santa Fe.
Mm.
And down there, all the different and then the person that I was staying with, her dad was involved in economic development of the 8 northern pueblos. And so we
Ah,
went around visiting. He and I went around to all the different pueblos and got to meet the governor of each one. It's kinda like a chief sort of thing, but and each one from an art standpoint had their own storyteller dolls because there was very much the tradition of the grandmother with you see all these little tiny little kids along their legs and that tradition of telling story and we d I think we missed a lot of opportunities here in our society because a lot of First Nations groups, actually a lot of other cultures, they embed their culture through the stories that they tell. And
yeah,
somehow we don't seem to have grabbed on to that, as
yeah.
nearly as right?
It is kind of a conundrum, sort of, because it's the most natural way of
Mm,
communication. It's
mhm.
been around forever, um, and, it worked with the parables in the Bible, it worked with, King Arthur and all those stories and other historical events and all of that. And yet, I think sometimes people think, "Well, that's too simple." We just this is a more complicated situation than we have to, divide it into parts and dissect it and all that. And we do miss an opportunity to contribute to the culture of our organization,
Mhm,
because out of that, in several clients that I had after that, they came up with internal programs of some sort or another, not to continue to practice telling stories, but
mhm.
that came out of some of those suggestions. And it takes it takes a while for it to connect at all the different levels that it needs to connect uh, in order to be an organizational wide thing. But it also contributes to the crafting or the development of corporate stories and telling them differently than we started in 1906
Mm,
and
right.
our great great grandfather did this and nobody cares about that. But if you talk about maybe the great great grandfather's feeling for why he wanted to start the company, or if the choices that he had to make in order to do that or the sacrifices or whatever, then it contributes more to the culture and helps people to understand why
Okay.
more easily.
So, are uh, any general observations around who makes better storytellers? Like, are women better storytellers than men, or men better than women, or are there any differences between the different generations, the Gen X, the Gen Y, the millennials, all that sort of thing? Any general observations that you've made over time?
I don't think there's any gender differences
Mhm,
in my experience. I haven't experienced that.
mhm.
Um I will say that because of all the technology that we have now, it's more difficult for people to put that down and actually think about a personal experience that they've had that they could share with somebody to illustrate a point because they're too busy, on their phone or whatever. And I'm not saying that's bad. I do it too. I mean, we all do it. That's how we communicate. But when we take the time to and have the opportunity to actually sit down one on one or in a small group or a large group for that matter, um, we can we can express more of how that made somebody feel or what motivated them to do something, which we
So
kind of miss with all the technology. At least I think we do.
so you've opened up because you said technology. I'm going to use this as a jumping off point, Susan, which is, what's the impact of AI on storytelling and creating stories? Or what are your observations about it? What any judgments or opinions do you have about that, good,
Oh,
bad, or otherwise?
I wouldn't. Mm, I don't want to call them judgments, but they probably are. Um, well, I've used AI,
Mhm,
not a lot, because I'm working in a different way now of coaching people, so I'm not preparing a lot of presentations like I used to. But that being said, I find that AI sometimes is helpful in getting me started.
mm, mhm,
You know, remind me of, or as a teenager, give me an example of how, whatever the point is that I'm trying to make, which will jog my
mm,
memory
mm.
into, oh yeah, I did something like that, and then I can translate it. I think the danger in that is you just take that story or that experience that Chat GPT or whatever, what I get all the letters mixed up. But anyway, whatever you're using, whatever form of AI gives you back, because it's good
Mhm.
usually. I mean, if you frame the question properly, then you get back what you want. And the difficulty with that is it's not personal. And when it's not personal, the connection is different. You might get somebody to listen to that story, but the connection of from authenticity, I'll get it out in a minute, and the real personal involvement that you had in that story, is not there.
So, I hope this isn't putting you on the spot that and you're not gonna say afterwards, "You should have told me you're gonna ask this," because I didn't know I was gonna ask it. And and and, can you think of a time can you tell me a story about an event that caused you to change the way that you look at the world or act in the world?
Well, the the story that I've told about the echo story, that's what I call it, um, is kind of like that. It helped me when I thought back on that event, because what happened in the story, very briefly, is that we had gone to this new village in Alaska in the summer just to check it out and make sure that we had a place to live and we had school supplies and all that kind of stuff. And so most of the village was gone because they were out fishing for so they would have stuff to eat in the winter. And so my son was there by himself, and he was an only child. He played by himself a lot.
Mm,
But pretty soon he got tired, and I was busy and he came, "Mom, what can I do? What can I play?" And I said, "Oh, you know what?" I said, "Don't get too close to the edge of the river, but go down by the river." And I could see him from the school,
mhm,
so I wasn't too worried. And yell across the river, "See that big mountain over there?" I said, "I bet there might be a little boy over there that yells back to you." And so he
mm,
did,
mm,
and he, "Hello, hello," and all this, and then but he got frustrated because he couldn't get an answer to a question. The little boy would just repeat what he
mm,
said, of course, and so pretty soon he came running back, and he had big tears, and he said, "Mom, that's a mean kid in there. He doesn't like me at all." And
ah,
and I said, "Well, you know what? Maybe if if you told him that you wanted to be his friend, you might get a different answer." Well, he didn't think I was real smart, so he fiddled around for a while, but finally, like little boys, he shuffled on back and threw a few rocks in the river, and then he yelled out again, and he said, "I'm 3 years old," and the kid said, "I'm 3 years old," and then he said, "Let's be friends," and the kid said, "Let's be friends," and he came hooping and hollering, and he said, "Mom, Mom, he really likes me, he wants to
mm,
be my
mm,
friend." And about that time, some of the people had come back to the village, and there was a little boy that came up to, I guess, to see what all the hooping and hollering was about, and off they went to play just like that was the natural
mm,
consequence. But the lesson was that even when the consequence of something that you tell somebody to do comes back negative, if you can reframe it so that
okay.
it'll come back positive, then that's something that telling that story helped me to communicate. I was a CEO for about 6 years, I guess, in the credit union industry,
Mm,
and, not of a credit union, of a support organization, and it was a back office operation. So I was the face of the organization, and my staff was all doing stuff, technical stuff. So I was the one that always went out and made the presentations to the boards about, "Don't you wanna make use of our services," and all this kinda stuff. And when somebody happened to come by our office, if I was there, that was fine because I could chat with them.
mm,
But if I wasn't there, the staff was really rude to them because they were interrupting their day, and what they had to get done. And I tried everything, and I'd never been a CEO before. I mean, there's a whole
mm,
bunch of stories about that, but and I said, "These are the people who pay our salary," and nobody cared, and, "Well, they shouldn't bother us if they want us to do good work," and finally, I told that story because I said to them, "We're getting complaints from our people that we serve, and if they complain, they're gonna not use our services anymore. You're not gonna have a job. I'm not gonna have a job." And I told them the story about the echo, and they went, "Oh, well, that makes sense. Why didn't you just tell us that before?" Because I was too dumb to do it because I didn't know. But, I mean, those are the kinds of things that you can use them for demonstration, like if you're trying to teach people how to tell stories or why they should or whatever, but they happen in real life too. And
mm,
and I was I mean, I was at my wit's end. I didn't know what was going to happen because they were just not happy with having visitors. And suddenly that story came to mind, and I thought, well, I'll try this. I've tried everything else, and I dock their pay. I mean, nothing. They didn't care until that, and then they said, "Oh, well, that makes sense."
New way to look at the world.
Yeah. So I mean, it takes a while to think about that and to do it intentionally, and I get that. And and organizations that I've worked with have to make an extra effort to,
Mhm.
remind themselves and all of that. And some of them do it really, really well, and some of them don't. And I wrote a book during COVID called Return on Influence. And it was about how to use stories to have greater impact and influence. And I used all kinds of different business type stories for the most part to show how different organizations had used stories to make things better, to have better customer experience, customer service, better, smoother operations, all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if anybody cares, but it became an Amazon international bestseller. So,
Well, I care, and we'll make sure that we put that in the program notes, Susan.
so, but I mean, that was my intent was maybe since, we're not really doing much during COVID, I'll just write that book I've been meaning to write and take some of these more corporate experiences of ways that people use storytelling to make significant changes in how they did business.
So let's assume that there are some people that are listening that would like to be storytellers, and I like to give listeners something that they could think about or do after they've listened to this. So if someone wanted to become a better storyteller, do you have any suggestions or tips you could leave them with on how to get started on that path?
Well, I personally, I I write everything down. I mean, just not the whole story, but even when I go to the grocery store sometimes and something weird is happening, or different, I'll just make a note. I carry a little notebook in my purse. I'm not fast enough on my phone to put it in my notes, but I guess I should practice that and then I'd be more efficient. But that's what I do, just to have a story bank sort of or a bunch of ideas of how you might, and you may not use it for
Mhm.
2 or 3 years, but suddenly, you'll come back to that, and they're all personal type experiences, whether it was somebody that was kind to you in the checkout, lane or whatever, or not,
Mhm.
and how did you deal with that and those kinds of things. So, that works for me. There are other people that have voluminous tablets and all these things where they immediately come back and, write kind of the whole story out and keep that until they want to, you know, use it for some reason. But for me, I'm not that organized and I don't want to use that much time. So I just write down you know,
That's a good
the,
tip to capture those so you have
yeah.
the content for the stories. Any suggestions on how to get better telling the story?
Well, of course, they could hire me to be their coach. Uh,
Okay, we'll put that
but
in the program notes as well.
Well, I mean, I think it really depends on how they're gonna use it. Are
Mhm.
they gonna use it in their business? And if so, where do they think they can use it to the most effectively? If
Okay.
they're somebody in the speaking industry, you know, they typically and they think they already tell all these wonderful stories, and they do, but they don't necessarily all resonate as deeply or as well as they could. And then we get caught up. In fact, I told a client the other day, I said, "You stop reading all those books for a while." I said, "You've got so many different things that you're telling me about how you could do this." And I said, "Pick one." And, and then, um, we'll we'll try to, help you with your stories that
Mhm.
way. But I said, they're not all gonna work for you." some people have 3 steps, some people have 7, some of us don't have any structure at all. We just kind of wing it and then try to put it together after we've figured it out. But it takes practice,
Mhm.
and I do eventually write my stories out if I'm
Okay.
gonna deliver them,
Okay.
um, and I read it out loud until not until I memorize it. I don't ever memorize it, but I just read it out loud so that I'm comfortable enough to not have to read it and I can deliver it. Then I record it on my phone and I listen to it and I figure out if there's, if my grammar is correct or if I got things in the wrong order, all those kinds of things. And I make notes on my written copy
Mhm.
and make, it's a bit of a process for me because I want to deliver it well. But it works for me. It wouldn't work for everybody. And I always tell people that I said, this is what I do. It works for me. And this is why it works for me. But if you're not, if you don't see the point in
Mhm.
in writing it out and recording it and practicing it, and that's really more for people like us that present.
Mm.
Uh, Occasionally, a CEO will do that as well because of their board meetings and those kinds of things where they're making more of a presentation than just acting as the facilitator. But,
So
yeah,
So some of the things that I've taken out of our conversation, Susan, are first of all that stories are a powerful way of communicating information. That they're more memorable, as you said. Also, in just this last bit of the conversation, it's if it's important to you, to capture and accumulate stories,
mhm,
right, that you can use, but then also to rehearse or practice like anything. If
mhm,
you want to get better at it, if you feel value in it, then whether you're, a parent, a CEO, whatever, practice and,
yeah.
tell the stories for
Yeah,
so
because if you don't practice, you're probably not gonna tell it very well. It'll be jerky, it'll be, "Oh, I forgot to tell you," those kinds of things, which we all do. I mean, I do that too when I'm first starting to, which is why I write it down.
Mhm.
And it's not so much the writing that is the thing, it's so I have a script, so to speak, uh, to to refer to, and then when I listen to it, does it flow right? Does it sound right? Or is it jerky? And if it's jerky or there's too many pauses or whatever, uh,
Mhm.
it's not about how many uhs and ahs and all that stuff. We
Right.
all do that. And and I don't care about that. And maybe I should, but I don't. Um, but I do care about telling a story in the most effective way to get your your point, your idea, your concept across to the people that you're sharing it with. And that takes a little work. It's just
I remember, I believe he's a friend of both of ours, Tim Gard.
yeah,
I remember Tim being asked one time about the stories that he tells and how does he make them also real? Do you rehearse it endlessly? And said, well, I used to, but now I don't think of retelling the story. I think of reliving the story.
yeah,
So it's so
yeah,
much in you that
yeah.
you're just describing something that's inside you and just letting it out.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, I'll refer back to the Echo story. When I deliver it, I yell across the river, and I act it out. I'm there again as mom and try to, kind of give the impression of a 3-year-old, which most people say isn't very hard for me, but that's a whole different conversation. But I mean, you do have to do that. You do have to relive it. Otherwise, the authenticity is lacking.
Right. And which is why it's hard to tell someone else's story because you
Yeah.
can't do it
Well, you yeah.
authentically.
No, in fact, I talked to a friend the other day, and she says, I tell 2 of your stories to this day." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah." She said,
Mm.
and she told me what they were, and I said, "Well, that's okay because I don't tell them anymore." But I was shocked because, well, she teaches at a university, and
Well, that's actually interesting. Maybe just one more thought before I close this off is that, like, when I think of your Echo story, I can think of my own echo story, when I
Yeah,
was a kid doing that. So
yeah.
that I
Like,
can live authentically,
yeah.
but to describe yours, it's
Oh,
gonna be
no.
I
No.
remember hearing someone one time saying, "This is like,
Yeah.
right?"
Yeah,
But,
yeah. Well, that's not fair to the person you heard it from, and it's not fair to you because it's not gonna come across the same.
right, and not fair to your audience by
Yeah,
extension.
definitely not too fair to your
So,
audience.
Susan, thank you very much
Thank
for being
you,
with me
this has
today. I
been
know it's
fun.
it's late in the day for you, and I really appreciate you
Uh,
taking the time.
well, I have a couch, that's all I got, and a bed, and, eventually the moving van will get here, so I'll have it all.
So now I can guarantee there's gonna be people that are listening to this and there's probably a story in there somewhere, but we're not gonna go with that today. So
Well, I'm available if anybody wants to chat.
awesome. Thank you so very much,
Thank
Susan,
you,
and
it was my
hope to
pleasure.
talk to you again soon. So,
I hope
David
so.
Gouthro, discover fresh perspectives. Next week, a new person and a different perspective. Come on back and join us then. Subscribe now because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.